So welcome to the second of our latest round of fireside chats with senior women working in finance. We're very lucky today to be joined by Marisa Drew, Chief Sustainability Officer for Standard Chartered. Welcome, Marisa.
Delighted to be here.
Lovely to have you. And actually, we spoke briefly a couple of weeks ago in preparation for this conversation. And I say briefly because when we asked you what questions you'd like us to cover, you said, ask whatever you want, Michaela.
Yep.
Which I have to say, very refreshing. Your assistant looked a little concerned, but very
She's used to this.
She's used to it.
I'm like,
but I'd like to start by, as we have with our other conversations over the last few weeks, taking you back a little bit and discussing your early career, actually, and why you decided to move into finance and banking, and really who inspired you, because actually looking back at your career, and particularly pre-banking, your career was far less linear than I realized.
Yes. Yeah, no, absolutely. So I'm a daughter of an Air Force pilot, and I think that certainly was somewhere in the back of my mind when I was thinking about what I wanted to do in the early days, before I really knew what it was like to get my first real job. And that informed me to the sense that I thought I wanted to serve my country somehow. So that was a little bit the inspiration I got from my father. And so early on, the way I was expressing that was possibly to be in politics or in some other capacity where I was serving my country. And I was fortunate enough to be able to get an early internship for a first-time congressman in the US. And I very quickly realized that that job wasn't for me, because I saw a very idealistic first-term congressman have lots of outside influences shaping the thinking, and it wasn't really his thinking. And that somehow was just didn't sit well with me. So I thought, well, maybe I could serve my country in a different capacity in the diplomatic corps somehow. Ended up working in the State Department. And without belaboring my very long and sordid journey, because I'm a person with, I think of myself as a high energy and short attention span, the burn rate of being in a diplomatic job where you're trying to influence through slow policy making was also something I think I was very impatient about. So that led me from sort of, I would say, the service, in the true sense of the word, service world, to maybe business. And I didn't grow up with a business environment, in that classic sense. Then had a summer internship in a corporate, and once again, it was a little bit of slow pace for me. So I count myself very lucky that when I was going through the recruiting process out of my undergraduate university, I stumbled on bankers coming to my college campus. And there was something about the bankers. They were highly dynamic. They spoke about what they did with enormous amount of enthusiasm. I got a sense of their intellect and their passion. And I didn't really know how to translate that, but I sort of said, I want some of that. And I got an internship in the very early days when the analyst programs in investment banking were just getting started. And the global analyst class was a whopping 30 people. But I fell into banking and absolutely loved it. And so for me, it was the high state of dynamism of the markets. There was something on the go all the time. And also intellectually, I was challenged. I was surrounded with people who were intellectual sparring partners. That whole idea of people who are challenging you every day spoke to me. So I just absolutely loved banking. And I did that for a couple of years. And I was serving the private equity community in a lot of the banking work that I was doing, and PE was just getting formed. And there's a little bit of a grass is always greener part to most of us. And I think I looked over at the private equity folks and thought, gee, if I wasn't doing banking, I might want to do that. So then I ended up working for a stint in private equity, but as a very junior person at a private equity firm, particularly in those old days, I was doing everything from fixing the coffee machine, as you do in a small early stage company,
to
doing deals, right? Yeah. And I thought, well, I'm doing too much of that and not enough deal doing. And the hit ratio when you're bidding on companies in the private equity context was much lower relative to what I was doing in banking. So I actually absorbed all those experiences that were very much, in a way, just dipping in and out of things. And ultimately, as I had those various experiences, I spent a lot of time thinking about what are the things out of those jobs that I really liked, and what are the things that I rejected because they didn't sit well with who I was as a person. And so ultimately went to business school, and coming out of the back end of business school was very, very deliberate. And I thought, I want to be in banking. I want to be in a fast-paced side of banking that was market related. And I also wanted something where I felt the impact of what I was doing. I could see that. So when you're working on a capital markets transaction and it's a big one and you're raising lifeblood capital for a firm and you can see the impact that has on the company's growth, was just such a pleasure for me. And so jumped into that space, and that was in the form of leverage finance, working with early, fast growing early stage companies, becoming, a trusted advisor or capital provider, and never looked back. So it was pretty much, that was kind of my journey for a very long period of time. And of course, the more senior I got, more things came along the way. So ultimately, I ended up looking after capital markets for my two large investment banks, and then ran investment banking, and then in a fateful moment moved into this world of sustainability in late 2017, but I'm sure we can cover that as part of this discussion.
It's interesting because I think that people's view of their careers and when they look at longevity of their careers in different businesses and different industries has really changed. And actually, I like that idea of trying on lots of different hats, trying out what works for you, but also what you're good at, what you're not good at. So actually you can sort of start to self-actualize some of the things that actually you enjoy doing.
Yeah.
And I think more and more, particularly some of the more junior candidates that we deal with, have got that more right perhaps than we have as we've been sort of growing up and moving through our careers.
And I think in our generation, there was this notion that that you would maybe have you work for one or two companies in your career. And certainly our parents' generation, you work for one company for life. And now you look at all the research that suggests that this generation will work for a minimum of 10 different organizations in their career, if not more. And that, I think, is actually quite instructive. And my little catchphrase is always, half of life is finding out as much what you don't want to do as it is what you do want to do. And how do you know what you do want to do unless you've got a bit of trial and error along the way? And that certainly worked for me.
Agreed. And as we were saying a little earlier before we started recording, I was actually in New York earlier this week talking to somebody that you know very well. And he said, how did he describe you? He said, Marisa is incredibly smart and capable. He said she is an absolute force of nature and she never sits still. So how do you sort of decompress? I mean, you've had a very high octane career in banking, and we'll go on to, as you said, in a while, some of the work you're doing at the moment, but how do you really decompress outside of that?
Yeah, I there's something about how I'm wired that relaxation doesn't work well for me. I'm either 100% all on, or I become very apathetic and I do nothing. So I sort of have to keep myself turned on, but I think I've got a brain that never shuts down. And so very intellectually curious. So I guess I need to be involved in things that feed my brain. So I'm a voracious reader, but I also, again, back to my short attention span, dip in and out of a lot of things. So everything from being a fledgling golfer and winemaker to a food enthusiast, what have you. But those are my ways of decompressing. But probably the thing I get most pleasure out of is interacting with people. So my happiest, fun moments outside of work would be getting a bunch of different people around a dinner table and having a really fascinating conversation that feeds me and actually keeps my energy up, because I do get energy from people. So yeah, my downtime is not the normal downtime. My husband says, your idea of vacation is just working in a different location. That's probably true. He knows me.
But it's true, but I think it's interesting and also slightly outdated, this view that work and life have to be very separate, because actually one thing that certainly I'm learning from a lot of these discussions that we're having is senior successful people have a lot of hobbies and a lot of interests. So particularly in a front-facing role like yours, being someone that's authentic and actually a more rounded individual, I'm sure is actually very helpful as you think about, as people think generally about their careers.
No, it's true. It's funny because people always ask, what are bits of advice that I can share after a 35-year career. And what I say is I really have learned that you can't look at life as being work or your personal life, at least not in my case. Both of those two are so inextricably interlinked, and they feed each other. So funny enough, my clients have become dear friends over many years. And I enjoy their company and the experiences that I've gotten. I call them life experiences, particularly out of banking. I've done some of those extraordinary things by virtue of my career, and where the personal life and the career life begin and end is very fluid. And some of my greatest interests have been born out of experience that I had in banking, going to a country, raising capital in an emerging market, and being with a principal riding horses in Medellin as I was building the telecom networks in Colombia.
Wow.
Through to, these are kinds of extraordinary experiences I could have never conceived of as being part of a work life when I was, early in my career. And yet those have fed into interests that have become those passions later in life. So for me, yeah, it's all one big blurry thing. but it's certainly
it's interesting when you talk about combining career and passion, actually, as we get on some of the work that you're doing at the moment. And as you said, after 20 years in what would probably be described as more mainstream banking and in M&A and capital markets and running big businesses in that space, I have to admit, I was quite surprised when I first saw you move into more of an ESG role. But I have to say, in hindsight, not surprised at all, because actually your network in that space and with those businesses, both large private equities and corporates in particular, and ability to mobilize capital towards some of the big issues that we have in this day and age is incredibly powerful. But how did you find that journey? What made you decide to make that move? And actually, it'd be interesting to hear a bit more about your experience so far.
Yeah. So I wish I could tell you this was highly strategic and very deliberate. Some of life is about seizing a moment and an opportunity and luck. And in my case, I was lucky in the sense that at the time prior to coming into sustainability, I was running investment banking and capital markets for Credit Suisse at the time. And my new-ish then CEO had called me into a meeting and asked me to come visit him in Switzerland to talk about something that he had on his mind. And what he had on his mind was, it wasn't defined as sustainability, but it was defined as something that he saw happening, shifting in the way our clients, whether they be private wealth clients or corporates, were trying to engage on these big topics that we're all grappling with now, whether it's climate change or systemic social issues or what have you. And they were trying to bridge the gap between whether it's their private wealth and putting it towards things that had positive outcomes and making change, or on the corporate side, responding to some of those challenges that were facing their businesses. And he said to me, this is big, this is real, and it's serious. My first reaction, being a cynical investment banker, was, what are you talking about? It wasn't in my frame of reference. And I was quite forceful with him and saying, I'm a P&L business person, I'm a business builder, blah, blah. And he said, no, I want you to actually absorb what I'm saying. I'm saying this is big and it's strategic and it's client facing. And I actually think it'll become a very, very important part of the strategic future of this organization. So it caused me a moment to self-check. And he challenged me to do a bit of digging and learn about the ecosystem a bit, and then come back and respond to this idea that this is a real business and it's something that he wanted me to think about taking on. And I did just that, and I kept an open mind. And the more I started to talk to people, I could absorb what he was seeing and actually couldn't articulate it in that same way. And I came back to him and I said, I get it now. I get it. This is going to be big, and this is probably one of the biggest things that I've ever come across in my career. And now I understand what you mean about this, and I'm in. Now, that was a baptism by fire moment, because when I said I'm in, I went from having a very traditional but also really big remit to, as you said, what was she doing? To literally, it was a secretary and a white sheet of paper. Right? It was basically creating a startup with underneath the umbrella of a big organization. And there was no roadmap for how to do this. You could barely even talk about what it was. Sustainability wasn't a thing per se. And most people's reaction was, I thought she was serious, or she went to the dark side, or I didn't realize she was one of those people. It's like this kind of like almost implication that I've lost the plot a little bit, or what have you. And so I had to really work quite hard to somehow translate what I was seeing as that forward vision into how it would relate to my partners. How do you incorporate this in your business? How do you understand that this is something that clients are asking for? And it's very understandable, because when there's a new thing, and I've built a lot of asset classes in new markets over my career, there's always that initial hesitation, right? Is this either a fad or a thing, or is it going to create a decent return for my client? Or if you're in the wealth business and you're an RM, you're very protective of your clients. You don't want to foist something on them that might not be suitable, all those sorts of reactions. And yeah, I had to work for quite a bit of time to convince people that this was real, that was important, and that they should embrace it because it was something that was going to be important to their businesses.
Yeah.
And yet translate it what's in it for them. And if you use the carrot and the stick approach, you sort of say in classic banker fashion, which gets competitive juices flowing, it's a risk to you if you don't do it. And the other side of that equation is if you do it, you will have a much better connection with your clients. And so ultimately that started me on the journey for being able to build that business inside what would potentially.
And also, I guess it's funny, you stepped into that time at a period where it's suddenly gone through an acceleration in terms of being in people's psyche. And as you said, it's sort of at your peril to ignore some of those issues now because they're so important from a societal perspective in terms of how businesses are thinking, people are thinking.
Yeah, there's no doubt. I mean, I knew it was going to be big, I never could have conceived that this was going to pervade everything. Every single business has to transform itself to respond to the sustainability equation. And it's not just climate, but climate is the dominant issue that people are responding to. And you can either look at it with the risk lens. If I don't do it, there's going to be a real problem in my business. I'll either lose customers or I'll have physical risk exposure or whatever it is. But you can also, and that's where I always try to appeal to hearts and minds, is that you can also look at it as a massive opportunity to transform. And if you are early in the journey, or if you seize and embrace it, you can be a forward leader, and in a funny way, you can ensure your own sustainability or longevity by seizing that moment, because the world has to change. Doing business the old way isn't an option. And we see it now everywhere. It doesn't matter what aspect of business or finance, sustainability is one of the most important topics, and everybody's got to respond to it in some way. So I feel very lucky that I got on the train before the acceleration curve.
It's interesting because there are some of those businesses that you described that are early adopters, and I would say real innovators that are seeing opportunity as well as challenges in that space. But there is also, as I know you often describe, there's a big group of us, I would say, because I would lump our firm into that category. But as we're thinking about financial services at large, that are well-meaning, that want to do more, but there's so much information out there trying to work out actually where they can have an impact, knowing that they want to, is very difficult to decipher. So how it's a Standard Chartered in your role specifically, do you help businesses to navigate that? Because that's a real challenge as well.
Yeah. It is a real challenge, and it's changing the equation of how business is done and expectations of corporates in particular. Now, it used to be the day that you really did serve one major constituency, and that was your shareholder base if you're a public company or even private. Now, this expectation of a corporate CEO about you need to have a stand on every major world topic. You need to have a position. You need to transform your business from a climate point of view. You need to embrace the views of this kind of multi-stakeholder capitalism concept, where your stakeholder church is much broader. You've got NGOs, you've got community writ large, you've got potentially regulators, investors, and your employee base, and they all have expectations of you. So what I would say is, I think within any organization, you need to understand in particular who gives you the license to operate, really? Is it who are your core clients and customers? Because that's where you always want to start, because you're in business to serve your clients. And every business is going to have a different answer to that question. And then what are the challenges that they're facing, and what are they expecting of you? And if you think about it with that lens, then it helps to define where you participate. I came into Standard Chartered, and it's an entirely different world. And I jokingly say it's opposite land to Credit Suisse, not only CSSC in terms of the letters, but almost in every way, we are an emerging markets footprint bank, 59 footprint markets, but very much our nexus is developing world. And that's Asia, Middle East, Africa principally. And the equation in sustainability is completely different than what we find in the West.
Starting point, that's the areas, right, where frankly investment in climate change, etc., is critical, right? Critical, because we can do everything that we've been doing for the last decade or so in the West, but if we don't bring these large developing markets, I woke up this morning to a statistic that says, India will now overtake China in terms of its population in the not too distant future as the largest economy in the world. And we've already overtaken the UK, by a long shot.
but also the composition of that economy is young. So the average age of most of these developing market economies is 35. In the West, it's 55, and so the dynamics are so different, but also your starting point of where you are on the sustainability journey. And there's automatic assumptions often in the West that everybody's in the same starting point. When I look at the economies, which was my big moment of arriving at Standard Chartered, and we in the West are trying to impose some of the will that we have to bring these countries along. You go and you talk to a middle income, fast growing developing economy whose primary source of energy is coal. Most of us think, coal's old news, right? And these economies are saying, that's pretty much my only source of energy. And you want me to get off of coal? You talk to an Indonesia and the ministerial bodies there will say, well, I've got 200,000 people in my country whose livelihoods are in the coal industry. Yes, I want to change. And yes, I know the urgency, but how am I going to make that transition and ensure that I've got jobs of the future for these people? That is, I have to solve that equation at the same time I'm transitioning from a high carbon emitting industry to renewables or whatever the appropriate energy source is for me in my country. These are really important and very serious issues. Then you move to even more to frontier markets in the developing world. And these are countries that are barely at the early days of energy access. I just want access to energy and heat and light and whatever. So there is a different equation. And there, many of these countries don't have a lot of financial resources in their governments. And if you say, you need to go build this infrastructure, that infrastructure, at the same time, they are faced with the realities of what climate change is doing to their countries. I classically say a lot of emerging markets, their primary contribution to their GDP is agriculture. Yeah. And yet we've got water shortage problems, we've got extreme heat, pest infestation with the biodiversity loss, all this stuff. And what are these countries going to do? This is the primary, source of income of a country. We have got to figure out a way that we can mobilize capital and help them, have different types of business models that are more climate resilient or resilient infrastructure and so on. So
that's
very
not just the domain of, I think everyone historically thought, well, that's more domain of the
government,
but actually, and the public sector, but actually businesses like yours can do a tremendous amount in terms of directing
big role to play
those areas that really need it, right?
So it's
and
quite a
really
mission.
Interact and play sort of hand in hand, which I know is not something that the private sector always necessarily does very well, but it's a multifaceted answer, isn't it, to that particular question? But
it's a massive opportunity, and it's important work, and I think I and my team feel this urgency and this sort of critical mandate, to try to mobilize capital at scale quickly. And we're talking, hundreds of billions and trillions of dollars have got to flow to solve some of these big problems. But private finance has such a huge role to play, and it cannot be something that we just assume is a government problem. And I always say, if something is born out of necessity, there will create commercial opportunities. So this isn't concessionary finance or donations or a gift or charity. This is real commercial for-profit business. And this is what I mean by if you seize the moment and the opportunity, there is an absolutely wonderful business model that you can create out of all of this. And that, I think, has been so much of what we get excited about. And there's a whole layer of innovation that's involved in that. It's not just classic technological innovation. Of course, that's a huge piece of it. We need technological innovation basically in every industry to help solve some of the thornier problems. But there's also, from a pure finance point of view, there's structuring innovation and new ways of thinking about creating financial products that can go and solve some of those problems. So it's my brain's on fire every day. Never dull.
And that's going back to the point you were making before, also about the carrot as well as the stick, because there's real opportunity for people that are forward thinking and innovating in that space. But there's also a lot of pressure at the moment in markets to focus more on the S, as you sort of alluded to earlier, of ESG. And I guess coming out of COVID was a real shot in the arm for just general awareness of the inequalities around things like housing and healthcare and employment and education. How are you thinking about that space and incorporating it in work?
So there's sort of two answers to that question. One is, I think COVID was a moment where people realized that the E and the S are inextricably interlinked.
Very much intertwined.
Yeah, before it was sort of there's the E or the S. It's not an either or, it's both. Most of the devastating effects of climate change become people problems, especially in the emerging markets. If we can't solve some of these issues, we're going to have mass migration, or we're going to have real people issues. So those two, I think the first point is that it's not either or. And so when we think about the decarbonization systemically of a country, we've got to think about those people issues that I was alluding to about the livelihoods of the new jobs of the future. But equally, I think when you're a practitioner in the space, you tend to always go to the noisiest place, and climate E is so noisy right now that if you're trying to do both, you're always responding to that urgent thing that's in front of you. So the way I'm attacking that here at Standard Chartered is I'm creating a job as head of social sustainability. So it's somebody's day job to focus on the S. And I think you need that freedom and that mandate to say, this is my job. And so that is everything from creating social products, financial products, or thinking about how the S can be incorporated into frameworks for the provision of capital and defining what S really means, because it's also quite a qualitative thing. It's not, climate change in a way it can be simple, and you can say it's one thing, it's carbon emissions. That's a little bit too simplistic, but you kind of get the point. That's right. Education and healthcare and gender equality and all these things that are under the big umbrella of S, much harder to define and more, a little bit amorphous for people. But we need to define that, because unless you can define it and create standards and principles around it, then you can't mobilize capital. But you have very, very good examples of when you can land on that and get it right and create a commercial proposition for investors, capital will flow at scale. The great example of that are social bonds. 3-4 years ago, social bonds didn't even feature in the equation of the markets, and now it's a $200 billion business, and that's like a 2-year phenomenon or 3-year phenomenon. So it can happen, and I think it just with a bit of intellectual horsepower applied to the topic, we can have some really interesting breakthroughs.
Yeah, and as you were saying, diversity and gender equality very much sit hand in hand with some of the issues around climate change. Although there's sometimes this criticism that there aren't enough women at the table having these conversations. What have you found in your experiences as senior women in that space?
Well, in sustainability, it's actually quite reasonably dominated by women. If you look at CSOs, and I'm sure you've done that work, but
yes.
If you look at the CSO positions, which is a new phenomenon, but one that's moved so fast. The idea of even having a CSO was a bit of a fringy thing a couple of years ago. Now, just about every major large cap company, every major bank has a CSO. And I would say, if my guess would be, it's at least 50-50, if not 60-40 women to men. Now, people ask me the question, well, why is that? Is that because it's a softer thing? That classic, cynical sort of view. I think there is one element that, that speaks to, I guess, the female psyche, that as a caregiver and a steward of passing on the world to your next generation, your kids or grandkids, you feel that passion and want to participate. But I also would maybe answer that question or think about that in a different way, which is when we think about mature industries, which were heavily dominated by men, the perpetuation of kind of that same model of who's successful in those roles, it's always easier to sort of do what's done before, that classic promoting in your likeness. This is a new position. So it creates that free space for somebody who doesn't have a history. It's not mature. What does a CSO look like? What are those skills? They're very different skills, and they're new skills. So I think it allows people to think a little bit outside the box in terms of who they place in those roles. And maybe there's an element there somehow of why we see that happening as well. So I don't think it's purely about the gender equation. I think it's kind of the nature of the beast about where this is in the maturation curve, and that's created an opportunity that I think which is tremendous. And I think it's kind of fun for me, having been, oftentimes, very much in the minority in traditional investment banking, to surround myself with incredibly passionate, incredibly bright, and very committed people who are making massive change within their organizations. So it's a fun time to be in this space too.
And talking about incredibly passionate and bright women, unfortunately, we don't have a huge amount more time, and it's a shame because this is a conversation where we can go so much deeper across many of the areas that we've covered. But to finish off, what advice would you give people that are either senior women that are looking to make a similar career change, or bluntly, if I look around my own organization, we have a lot of particularly junior individuals that say, I want to make an impact and I actually want to do something that could bring about change in our organization and other organizations. What advice would you give to them?
Well, the great thing is, unlike a few years ago where the opportunities were limited perhaps to be in sustainability as a full-time job, and or whether there was a recognition that this was truly strategic and not something that was destined to be on the fringe. Now sustainability does permeate everything. It really does. And when we think about banking, just in particular, banking is always something that tends to imply that there's sort of one job. Banking is thousands of jobs.
Yeah.
And within the thousands of jobs in banking, because sustainability is pervading the entire organization, it doesn't matter whether you want to work in the legal field, in the compliance field, in the facilities management field, in M&A, in capital markets. There's a sustainability overlay to every single one of those 1,000 jobs. So I would start by saying, what is the job type that you're interested in? Do you want to go in legal profession or capital markets or M&A or whatever? If you're passionate about sustainability, first get a core competency in that discipline, because that's your ultimate beginning value add for that organization. And then put the sustainability layer, and how is sustainability relevant to that job function? If you're a lawyer right now, there's climate change litigation, which is a new thing. So that's your sustainability overlay on a legal job within, say, banking. If you're a capital markets person, it's all the new financial products which are sustainability linked. So it's starting with the core competency in the job function and then adding that sustainability overlay. And then you had that perfect, what I'd say, proposition for adding value in a sustainability job within any organization. And I'm speaking specifically to banking because that's my world, but you could translate that exact same thing in corporates. There's sustainability marketing jobs, there's some comms jobs, like even those skills that people don't necessarily attribute to a truly sustainable career, but yeah, they're everywhere.
And particularly a lot of the youngsters that we work with, I have to say, we're seeing more than any others in financial services. They also have the ability to move with their feet if they don't believe they're supporting or working for a business that they feel comfortable has the right outlook in terms of some of the issues that we discovered.
Yeah, and I always said that's my other piece of advice when people are starting out early in their career. They say, what should I focus on? If I'm being slightly more holistic rather than specific, I say go where the growth is, right? Go for the industries that are in their growth curve, because by definition, opportunity will present itself and there will be many, many jobs created. If you're going, at the top of the market in a cycle or a part of the business that's in a slow decline, by definition, you're in a shrink place and opportunities will get thinner and thinner. And for the foreseeable future, if we say the world has committed to net zero by 2050, that's going to provide you a lot of decades worth of runway to seize an opportunity. And I think it's just so rich, and that's why I think it's keeping you busy probably in sustainability.
It is.
I need a sustainability practice because I've got to serve the demand on the other side. So there you go.
But look, it's been a pleasure chatting to you, Marisa. Thank you so much for taking the time. I've said a lot of ground covered.
Good. Well, it's absolutely my pleasure, and I'm very, very happy to chat. And as always, happy to support you and your organization. You guys are always doing great things for my industry. So happy to repay the favor.
Thank you very much. Take care.